Let's get philosophical. Critical Reflections on Conspiracy Theory. Authored by Kurtis Hagen. The following podcast episode is the third part of a three-part series on the reliability of the media regarding conspiracy theories. It is mostly an excerpt from the Appendix, 9/11 and Epistemic Authorities, taken from the book, Conspiracy Theories and the Failure of Intellectual Critique, published in 2022, by Kurtis Hagen.
Is the mainstream media reliable regarding conspiracy theories? Part 3, a couple examples involving 9/11. In this podcast, I describe two cases in which mainstream media outlets handled evidence relevant to the assessment of what happened on September 11th in a misleading way. These are merely examples that provide a concrete sense of the various ways in which the mainstream media can, and sometimes does, mislead its audience regarding the evidence related to conspiracy theories. But before providing examples of the mainstream media's questionable treatment of 9/11, let's take a brief trip down memory lane. The question here will simply be, how far might a TV news magazine go in creating a misleading presentation? Dateline's explosive exposé. In 1992, the television show Dateline NBC hired the Institute for Safety Analysis to conduct crash demonstrations involving GM trucks of a certain vintage. They did this to, quote, see for ourselves what might happen in a side impact crash, unquote. The results were dramatic, indeed, they were explosive. In one of the demonstrations, the car impacting the side of the truck was engulfed in flames. But it turns out that Dateline had allowed its contractor to take steps to ensure such a result. These steps, needless to say, were concealed from the audience. Forced by a GM lawsuit to publicly confess, Dateline co-anchors Jane Pauley and Stone Phillips apologized on air. The confession/apology tells the story. It goes as follows.
1. NBC's contractor did put incendiary devices under the trucks to ensure that there would be a fire if gasoline were released from the truck's gas tank. NBC personnel knew this before we aired the program, but the public was not informed, because consultants at the scene told us the devices did not start the fire. We agree with GM that we should have told our viewers about these devices. We acknowledge the placing of the incendiary devices under the truck was a bad idea from start to finish. 2. The Dateline reporter said, quote, at impact, a small hole was punctured in the tank, unquote. That was based on a report from a consultant at the scene. GM has now X-rayed the tank and found no hole. We have performed no such tests but do not dispute their X-rays. 3. We said the speeds at impact were around 30 miles per hour and about 40 miles per hour. GM says the speeds were at least 39 miles per hour and 47 miles per hour, and says we substantially misrepresented the energy involved in each of these side impacts. We do not dispute GM's calculations. 4. Lastly, in reporting on the crash that resulted in a fire, we said the crash, quote, forced gasoline to spew from the fuel cap, unquote. GM says since the gas cap, which now cannot be found, was the wrong cap for the GM filler tube, and because the gas tank was overfilled, the cap came off when the impact occurred. The gasoline came out of the open end of the filler tube. We do not dispute this. Therefore, this unscientific demonstration was not representative of an actual side impact collision.
What does this tell us? It shows that a seemingly reputable TV news magazine backed by a major network would collude with a seemingly reputable contractor to produce what may now be justly labeled fake news. National Geographic on the power of thermite. Now let's turn to a National Geographic documentary, 9/11 Science and Conspiracy, which attempts to debunk several positions held by at least some members of the 9/11 Truth Movement, with the help of experts from the Energetic Materials Research and Testing Center, which will be referred to as EMRTC. Since many members of the 9/11 Truth Movement believe that some form of thermite was involved in the destruction of the World Trade Center skyscrapers, EMRTC performed an experiment. The narrator frames it this way.
Was thermite the main cause of the building collapse? Once again, there is a way to find out. EMRTC calculated a controlled experiment to see if thermite was a viable option in the collapse of the towers.
National Geographic clearly signals that the experiment had the potential to show that the use of thermite is not a viable explanatory cause of the destruction of the WTC buildings. To do this, they used what they acknowledged was the weakest kind of thermite, standard powdered thermite, to address the question.
Can thermite of any kind burn through steel beams?
Exhibiting a remarkable lack of imagination, the hired experts poured large quantities of thermite around a steel beam, with no attempt to concentrate a pressurized stream of thermite on the beam. After the thermite was ignited and burned away, the beam remained essentially undamaged. The experts seemed to imply that they had thereby shown that cutting a steel beam cannot be done with thermite of any kind. And the so-called truthers interviewed on the show, David Ray Griffin, Richard Gage, and Dylan Avery, being unmoved by this demonstration, were depicted as irrationally committed to their position. In a less interesting experiment, EMRTC shot an aluminum tube through a box and compared the result with blowing the box up. The results, which were hardly surprising, were supposed to have some relevance to whether or not a Boeing 757 hit the Pentagon. Again, the truthers were not so subtly ridiculed for not being impressed. This documentary prompted engineer Jonathan Cole to do his own experiments. Instead of using ordinary thermite, Cole used a form of thermite called thermate, which includes sulfur and some other chemicals. It is the added sulfur, Cole explains, that, quote, helps form a eutectic that lowers the melting point of steel, unquote. Using a simple makeshift device for directing the flow of the thermate as it reacts, Cole demonstrated that, in fact, relatively small amounts of thermate can cut through steel beams. Now, let's disregard the question of whether Cole's experiment shows what it seems to show, that some kind of thermite, in some kind of configuration, can cut steel beams, and treat this merely as a hypothetical possibility. Does that alone give us reason to regard the National Geographic experiment as unfair and deceptive? Yes. The experiment was presented as if it seriously undermined the notion that thermite may have played a significant role in bringing down the WTC buildings. But clearly it does not. National Geographic frames the experiment with the ambiguous question, quote, can thermite of any kind burn through steel beams, unquote. Do they mean, can thermite of any kind, no matter how strong, burn through steel beams? No. They didn't test the strongest kind. So we must take the question to mean, can thermite of any kind, no matter how weak, burn through steel beams? But a negative answer to this question tells us little if anything about the relevant issue, whether a role for thermite, of some kind, could have been possible. It seems that National Geographic structured the experiment for the greatest effect, like Dateline NBC, rather than as a genuinely informative experiment. They seem to have set things up so that the viewer would conclude that even enormous quantities of thermite could not have been instrumental in bringing the buildings down, thereby undermining the thermite hypothesis. This doesn't mean National Geographic was intentionally deceptive. They may have been operating under such a strong bias that awareness of even the most obvious problems with their experiment did not rise to the level of consciousness. Presumably, not everyone involved was in the same state of mind. Some participants may have had some degree of deceptive intent, or a willingness to go along with what they recognized as not fully rational, while others may have been completely well-intentioned, but either blinded by bias, incompetent, or not paying close attention. What is the likely effect of this kind of experiment regarding the belief in conspiracy theories? Intensified polarization. Specifically, those who already think that the thermite hypothesis is silly may or may not be fooled by the bogus reasoning underlying the experiment. Their views will either remain unchanged or will tend to be strengthened for the wrong reasons. Those who already believe the thermite hypothesis, being more motivated to be critical, will remain unconvinced, as they should be, even if they are in fact wrong. Indeed, their belief will likely be strengthened by the very fact that the attempt to refute their position was such a sham. Responding to conspiracy theories with what will rightly be called hit pieces is neither a noble nor effective way to dissuade people from belief in conspiracy theories. That is not the high road. We should not conclude from this that it is a bad idea to address the technical issues involved in conspiracy theories. Rather, it is bad to address them badly. ABC News on William Rodriguez's story. Let's consider another example. In this one the problem is subtler and requires background knowledge for the viewer to fully recognize it. William Rodriguez was a custodian in the North Tower. He had a master key that was used to unlock doors for firemen. He went up through the building, leading the firemen, as he was familiar with the building, and he helped rescue many people. He was a hero and was celebrated and recruited, for a time, by the Republican Party. But that isn't the most interesting part of his story. According to his own harrowing account, Rodriguez was the last person to make it out of the North Tower alive. He dove under a fire truck to avoid falling debris and was rendered unconscious as the area was covered in thick dust. He was then dragged out from under the fire truck before the ground under part of it gave way. He would have been crushed. But that's not the most interesting part of his story either, at least not for our purposes. Rodriguez insists that there was an explosion in the basement, below him, several seconds prior to the first airplane hitting his building. He reports having testified to this in a closed session of the 9/11 Commission. His claim is interesting because it supports the notion that explosives were involved in bringing the building down. That's the background. Our focus here is on how the media dealt with his story, not the accuracy of his story itself. ABC News ran a report that featured Rodriguez, portraying him favorably, saying, quote, "Instead of running from danger, he ran straight to it," unquote, and characterizing him as a, quote, "changed man, an activist fighting for disaster relief for the Hispanic community," unquote. It is all very heartwarming and presumably true, as far as it goes. And yet there is something misleading about the report. When it came to Rodriguez's account of what happened, ABC hijacked his story right at the critical point. The voiceover provides an interpretation of what Rodriguez is saying that contrasts sharply with his actual position.
Voiceover: On the morning of 9/11, he was in the basement. Rodriguez: We hear boom, an explosion so loud that it pushed us upwards in the air, and we started screaming. We didn't know what it was. Voiceover: It was the first hijacked plane that hit the tower.
Rodriguez had long maintained that there was a loud explosion in the basement before the plane hit the tower. He believes he heard the plane impact several seconds after the explosion in the basement. Rodriguez's story seems to have evolved somewhat from his first account on the day of 9/11 itself, which described a big rumble. And it is always possible that any witness might be lying, exaggerating, or misremembering, or some combination. But the accuracy of Rodriguez's account is not my concern here. My concern is the reliability of such entities as ABC News. Did they edit their report to alter Rodriguez's story in order to make it better conform to the official story? Rodriguez maintains that they did. And it certainly appears from what remained in the report, that the explosion pushed people up in the air, that Rodriguez was trying to relate his account of an explosion coming from below, which he regards as unrelated to and indeed preceding the airplane strike, a point which Rodriguez consistently took pains to emphasize. He consistently and adamantly denies that the first boom he heard was the first hijacked plane that hit the tower. It is hard to believe the reporters failed to understand this. It seems ABC News decided to override Rodriguez's story with its own, the official story, without indicating to the audience that Rodriguez was in fact opposing the official version of events on that very point. This may be innocent in the sense that the people at ABC News presumably believed that the boom that Rodriguez heard must have actually been from the plane impact, even if Rodriguez himself maintained that it preceded it. And so they included what they presumably regarded as a fact in place of what they regarded as a mistaken understanding on the part of Rodriguez. They were, after all, just trying to produce a feel-good puff piece, and they didn't want anything to distract from their purpose. This is all perfectly understandable, and almost excusable. But it is important to recognize that we may be surrounded by subtle manipulations of this kind that reinforce official accounts of controversial events. By itself, this particular case is insignificant. But it nevertheless exemplifies how the media can manage public perceptions, and it reminds us that they sometimes do exercise this power, even if not intending to deceive. Regarding conspiracy theories, it may be reasonable to expect that this kind of manipulation, which may mostly be innocent in intent, is relatively pervasive.
You have been listening to the third part of a three-part series on the reliability of the media regarding conspiracy theories. This material was excerpted from the Appendix, 9/11 and Epistemic Authorities, taken from the book Conspiracy Theories and the Failure of Intellectual Critique in 2022, by Kurtis Hagen.